The richest man in the valley vanished overnight, and by sunrise he was lying in the mud like a beggar no one cared to save. In the spring of 1933, William Ashford owned more land than most men could dream of. His ranch stretched across the hills like a kingdom, and every smile he received seemed to bow first to his money before it ever reached his face. After 8 lonely years as a widower, William had begun to wonder if anyone could still see the man beneath the fortune. So he made a reckless choice. He traded his fine coat for a worn-out shirt, left his grand house before dawn, and stepped onto the road as a penniless ranch hand. Not even the people who passed him knew the truth. To them he was just another poor drifter with muddy boots and nothing to offer. Then the storm came. Thunder cracked over the valley. His old horse slipped near a ravine and William crashed down hard among the rocks. His leg twisted beneath him. Rain soaked his face. Wagons passed. Riders looked down, then looked away. For the first time in his life, William understood what it meant to be invisible. Near dusk, Grace Miller, a widow with barely enough bread for her little daughter Emily, found him trembling in the rain. She had nothing extra. No money, no comfort, no reason to risk herself for a stranger. But Grace saw a suffering man. And that was enough. Grace Miller did not scream for help because she had learned long ago that help did not always come when poor women called. Instead, she tightened her shawl against the rain, looked at her little daughter and said, "Emily, hold that horse steady. Don't be afraid." The child's eyes were wide, but she obeyed. Grace stepped down into the mud, her worn shoes sinking with every move, and knelt beside the stranger. His clothes were torn. His face was pale. His right leg lay twisted in a way that made her stomach tighten, but Grace did not look away. She had seen pain before. She had buried a husband. She had carried hunger in her body and hidden fear behind a calm face so her daughter could sleep at night. "Can you hear me?" she asked. The man opened his eyes. For one brief second, William Ashford forgot the lie he was living. He forgot the ranch, the money, the fine house on the hill. All he saw was a woman soaked by the storm looking at him, not as a burden, not as a stranger from the road, but as a human being worth saving. "I fell," he whispered. "I can see that," Grace said softly. "Now, we have to get you home." Home? The word almost made him laugh from the pain. This woman's home was not the kind of place men like him were carried into. It was a small weathered cabin near the edge of the fields with a roof patched more than once and a door that leaned slightly against the wind. Yet, Grace said the word with such quiet certainty that William believed her. The walk back was slow and punishing. Grace took most of his weight on her shoulder, though she was not a large woman. Her strength came from years of lifting water buckets, kneading bread dough before sunrise, scrubbing clothes until her fingers ached, and sewing by lamplight when her eyes begged for rest. Every step told William something about her life. This was not weakness dressed in poverty. This was dignity hardened by survival. Inside the cabin, Emily ran to light the stove. Grace helped William onto a narrow bed near the wall, then moved with practiced care. She warmed water, tore a clean strip from an old sheet, and examined his injured leg. There was no panic in her hands. Only purpose. "We don't have much," she told him, "but you'll be dry here." William looked around. A basket of unfinished sewing sat beside the table. A small sack of flour leaned in the corner, carefully folded at the top to make it last. Near the stove, a pan waited for the morning bread Grace would sell in town. On a chair hung a child's freshly washed shirt, the only good one Emily owned. He understood then that this woman had almost nothing extra to give. And still she had given him shelter. Emily stood beside her mother, watching the stranger with cautious curiosity. "Is he going to die?" Grace looked at William, then back at her daughter. "Not if we can help it." The sentence was simple. No grand promise. No drama. Just the steady voice of a woman who had spent years fighting life one hard day at a time and had not let it make her cruel. For the first time since leaving his mansion, William felt something break open inside him. He had gone into the world searching for proof that love could exist without money. In Grace Miller's poor little cabin, with rain beating against the roof and a child warming her hands by the stove, he began to understand that the richest hearts are often found where the world expects the least. That night, William Ashford did not sleep. The rain had softened to a steady whisper against the roof, and the little cabin smelled of smoke, wet earth, and warm cornmeal. Across the room, Grace sat near the stove with a needle in her hand, mending a tear in Emily's dress by the low light of a lamp. Her face was tired, but her back stayed straight. Every stitch was careful, every breath quiet, as if even exhaustion had to wait its turn in her house. William watched her through half-closed eyes. She had no idea who he was. To her, he was not the owner of Ashford Ranch. Not the man whose land reached beyond the river and up into the hills. Not the widower whom every family in the county whispered about at church socials and market stalls. He was only an injured stranger taking up space in the one room she could barely afford to keep warm. And still she had given him the bed. That single act unsettled him more than the fall, more than the pain in his leg, more than the storm that had nearly swallowed him whole. For years William had lived behind polished doors and careful manners. People smiled when he entered a room, but their eyes always traveled past him to his coat, his watch, his land, his name. Widowed for 8 years, he had grown used to polite voices wrapped around hidden hunger. Mothers introduced their daughters with too much sweetness. Men laughed at jokes he had not meant to be funny. Neighbors praised his character while counting what marriage to him might be worth. Only a week earlier he had overheard the Hartwell family outside the chapel, speaking as if he were not a man at all but a prize waiting to be claimed. Eleanor would be the better match, one of them had said. She knows how to speak to wealthy men, another voice had answered. It doesn't matter which girl he likes, it matters which one can become mistress of Ashford Ranch. William had stood behind the chapel wall frozen. The words had not surprised him. That was the worst part. They had only confirmed what loneliness had been telling him for years. No one wanted William. They wanted Ashford. They wanted the house, the land, the horses, the silver, the name that opened doors before he even reached them. So he had done the only thing desperate enough to feel honest. He had put on a dead worker's old shirt, left his fine clothes behind, and walked away from his own life to see what remained when the world believed he had nothing. Now he had his answer, or at least the beginning of one. Grace rose from her chair and came to check the cloth wrapped around his leg. The swelling hasn't gotten worse, she said softly. That's good. You should have left me there, William murmured. She looked at him almost offended. A decent person doesn't leave someone suffering in the mud. He turned his face away, ashamed by how simple she made goodness sound. Outside, the valley lay dark and quiet. Somewhere beyond the fields sat his grand house full of polished wood and empty rooms. But inside this poor cabin beside a widow who owned almost nothing and still gave what she had, William felt the first true warmth he had known in years. And for the first time he feared the day Grace would learn his real name. By morning the storm had passed, but its damage remained. Water dripped from the edge of the roof in slow, stubborn drops. The dirt road outside had turned soft and brown, and the hills beyond the cabin were covered in a pale mist. Grace Miller had been awake long before sunrise, not because she had slept enough, but because women like her did not have the luxury of resting until life felt fair. She stood at the table, slicing the last small loaf of bread into careful pieces. Emily watched from beside the stove. "Mama, is that all we have?" Grace paused for half a second, then smiled, the kind of smile mothers use when they are trying to hide the truth from a child who already knows it. "It's enough for today." But William heard the silence underneath her answer. He lay on the narrow bed, his leg wrapped tight, his body aching with every breath. He had known hunger as an idea, as something discussed by church committees and county meetings. But here, in this little cabin, hunger had a sound. It was the scrape of a knife cutting bread thinner than it should be. It was a child asking a question too softly. It was a mother pretending not to count every crumb. Grace brought him a piece first. William stared at it. "No," he said. "Give that to your daughter." Grace did not move. "You need strength." "So does she?" "She has me," Grace answered. There was no pride in her voice. No performance. Just truth. She had been standing between her daughter and the world for years, and she did it so naturally that William almost could not bear to look at her. He took the bread, because refusing it would only insult the gift. A little later, Grace stepped outside to check on the old horse. Emily followed with a tin cup of water, and William was left alone with the sound of their voices drifting through the open door. He looked around the cabin again, the patched blankets, the cracked bowl, the sewing stacked in a basket waiting to be finished for someone who would probably pay late. This woman had every reason to send him away. A stranger meant more work, more food, more risk, more whispers from neighbors who already knew how quickly poverty could turn into judgment, and yet she had not asked what he owned. She had not asked whether anyone would repay her. She had not even asked if helping him would cost her more than she could afford. She had simply seen him suffering and chosen mercy. When Grace returned, she carried a bundle of wild herbs in one hand and a small pail of water in the other. Her skirt was wet at the hem. Her hair had slipped loose around her face. "I'll clean the wound again," she said. "It may hurt." William looked at her hands, rough red from cold water and years of labor, but steady. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Grace glanced at him. "Doing what?" "Helping me." For the first time she seemed almost angry. "Because someone should have." The word struck him harder than the fall into the ravine. All his life people had helped him because he was powerful, because his name could reward them, because his gratitude was worth something. Grace Miller helped him when she believed he had nothing at all. And in that moment, William understood that the storm had not ruined his plan. It had revealed the answer he had been searching for. William had believed he understood hardship. He had listened to men speak of poor harvests. He had signed papers lowering rent after dry seasons. He had paid doctors for injured workers and sent sacks of grain to families when winter came early. People called him fair. Some even called him generous. But lying in Grace Miller's cabin with his leg throbbing and his stomach tight from half a slice of bread, William understood that generosity from a full table was not the same as survival from an empty one. The memory of the road would not leave him. He could still feel the rain beating against his face, cold and merciless. He could still hear the wheels of the wagon passing above the ravine. The driver had seen him. William knew he had. Their eyes had met for one brief second through the curtain of rain. Then the man looked away. Not because he was cruel, perhaps. Maybe because he was tired. Maybe because stopping for a poor stranger meant trouble, lost time, danger, or responsibility he could not afford. But whatever the reason, the result was the same. William had been left in the mud like a broken thing. Then came the riders. 2 men on horseback, their hats pulled low, their coats dark with rain. One of them slowed and looked down toward the ravine. William had tried to lift his hand, tried to call out, but his voice broke beneath the thunder. The rider said something to the other man, something William could not fully hear, but the tone was clear enough. Not worth stopping for. They rode on. For 20 years, William Ashford had never crossed a road without someone tipping a hat. Men stepped aside for him at the market. Women lowered their voices when he entered the churchyard. Strangers knew his name before he knew theirs. His money had moved through the valley like an invisible hand, opening gates, softening faces, bending the world around him. But without his coat, without his horse, without his name, he had become no one. A poor man in torn clothing. A burden. A risk. A body in the rain. Grace came in carrying a bowl of warm water and set it beside the bed. "You're quiet," she said. "I was thinking. That can be dangerous when a man is hurt." He almost smiled, but the heaviness in his chest would not allow it. "Do people always pass by like that?" he asked. Grace looked at him carefully. She did not ask what he meant. She already knew. "Sometimes," she said. "Why?" She dipped the cloth into the water and wrung it out. "Because poor people learn early that suffering is common. And when something is common, some folks stop seeing it." William closed his eyes. That was the truth he had never paid enough to learn. Grace cleaned the mud from a cut near his wrist. Her touch was gentle but practical, shaped by a life that left little room for softness and yet had not taken it from her completely. "I saw you," she said after a moment. William opened his eyes. Grace did not look away. That was enough. The words stayed with him long after she turned back toward the stove. Outside, the valley was waking. Somewhere beyond the mist, men were already walking to fields he owned, leading animals, sharpening tools, carrying burdens he had once measured in wages and ledgers. William had thought he knew them because he paid them fairly. Now he wondered how many times he had passed suffering without recognizing its face. And for the first time in his life, being invisible had made him see. By the second day, Grace Miller's small cabin no longer felt like a shelter from the storm. To William, it began to feel like a place where a man could be put back together piece by piece. Not because it was comfortable. It was not. The roof still leaked in one corner when the wind shifted. The floorboards creaked. The blankets were thin and every stick of firewood had to be used with care. But there was a steadiness in that home that William had never felt in the grand rooms of Ashford Ranch. Grace moved through each morning with quiet purpose. Before the sun had fully climbed over the hills, she was already kneading dough at the table, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her hands. Emily sat nearby, sounding out words from an old schoolbook while stealing worried glances at the stranger in the bed. "You're staring, sweetheart," Grace said without turning around. Emily quickly looked down. "I wasn't." William smiled faintly. It hurt less than the day before. Grace shaped the dough into small loaves, then covered them with a cloth. After that, she checked William's bandage, heated water, brewed bitter herbs, and made sure he drank every drop. She did not fuss over him. She did not speak as if he were helpless. She treated his pain like something serious, but not something that gave him permission to stop being a man. That too healed him. At Ashford, ranch servants had always rushed to meet his needs before he named them. A clean shirt appeared. Coffee was poured. A horse was saddled. A fire was lit. Everything came so easily that he had mistaken convenience for care. But here, every act cost something. When Grace gave him warm broth, William knew it meant less for her and Emily. When she changed the cloth around his leg, he saw that the fabric had come from one of her own worn sheets. When she stayed up late sewing beside the stove, he understood she was making up for the hours she had lost caring for him. And she never complained. One evening, as the light faded gold through the doorway, William watched Grace repair a torn pair of Emily's stockings. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes were heavy. "You should rest," he said. Grace gave a soft laugh. "Rest doesn't pay rent." The words were plain, almost gentle, but they carried the weight of her whole life. William looked toward Emily, who had fallen asleep with her head on folded arms at the table. "She's a good child," he said. "She's all I have," Grace answered. For the first time, her voice broke just slightly. Only slightly. But William heard it. In that moment he saw more than a poor widow. He saw a woman who had buried grief and kept walking. A mother who turned hunger into hope, fear into work, and loneliness into love strong enough to warm a room. Grace's cabin was not rich. It was not safe from the world. But inside those fragile walls William Ashford began to heal in ways no doctor at his ranch could have managed. His leg would mend with time. The deeper wound, the one left by years of being wanted for his fortune and never for his heart, was healing because one tired widow had looked at him when he had nothing and still made room for him beside her fire. The third morning brought a different kind of silence. It was not the gentle silence of dawn or the tired silence that settled over Grace Miller's cabin after a long day of work. This silence felt sharp, like the whole little house was holding its breath. Emily was sick. At first it seemed like nothing more than a light fever. A warm forehead. Heavy eyes. A child who did not ask questions before breakfast and did not run to the doorway when the chickens scratched outside. But Grace noticed every change. She noticed the way Emily's hand stayed limp in hers. She noticed the dry sound in her breathing. She noticed the small shiver that passed through her daughter even though the stove was burning. William watched from the bed as Grace pressed a cool cloth to Emily's forehead. "She'll be all right," he said softly, trying to give comfort. Grace did not answer. Her face had changed. The woman who had lifted him from the mud cleaned his wounds, stretched half a meal into 3 portions and stood firm against every hard thing life had placed before her, now looked frightened in a way William had never seen. Not loud. Not helpless. Just still, as if one wrong breath might break something. Emily opened her eyes. "Mama." "I'm here, sweetheart," Grace whispered at once. "I'm right here." Those words were calm, but William heard what was hidden beneath them. Grace had said those same words before. Maybe beside a sickbed. Maybe beside the man she once loved. Maybe in the terrible hours before she became a widow with a little girl and no one left to lean on. For the first time William understood that Grace's strength was not the absence of fear. It was the choice to keep moving while fear had both hands around her heart. She tucked the blanket tighter around Emily, then stood too quickly as if work could keep panic away. She reached for a small bundle of herbs, checked the water, adjusted the fire, then checked the child again. Her hands moved fast, but her eyes stayed on Emily's face. William pushed himself up on one elbow. Pain shot through his leg, but he ignored it. "Grace," he said gently. "Sit down for a moment." "I can't." "Just for a moment." She turned then, and the wall she carried inside her cracked. Her eyes shone, but she did not let the tears fall. "I lost her father," she said, barely above a whisper. "I won't lose her too." The cabin seemed to shrink around those words. William had heard many kinds of grief in his life. Polite grief at funerals. Quiet grief in empty rooms. His own grief after losing his wife. But this was different. This was a mother's fear, raw and living, the kind that does not belong to the past because it wakes up every time a child coughs in the night. Emily stirred again, reaching out blindly. Grace went to her at once and took her small hand. "I'm here," she repeated. "I'm not going anywhere." William looked at them, the poor widow and the feverish child, bound together by love, loss, and the stubborn will to survive. And something inside him softened even more. He had come looking for a woman who could love a man without fortune. But watching Grace fight her fear for the sake of her daughter, William began to understand something deeper. A heart like hers did not love lightly. When Grace loved, she stayed. By evening, Emily's fever began to break. It did not happen all at once. There was no miracle, no sudden breath of joy that swept through the cabin and erased the fear. It came slowly in small signs only a mother would notice. Her fingers warmed, her breathing softened. The tight little crease between her brows disappeared. When Grace touched her cheek, Emily opened her eyes and whispered, "I'm thirsty." Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she smiled as if the whole world had been handed back to her. William watched from the bed, and something inside him shifted in a way he could no longer deny. He had admired Grace from the moment she pulled him from the ravine. He had respected her strength, her decency, the quiet pride with which she carried poverty without letting it stain her soul. But watching her bend over Emily with trembling relief, watching love return the color to her face, he felt something deeper than gratitude. He felt the first ache of love. Not the polished kind he had seen in parlors where women wore fine dresses and spoke carefully of weather, music, and family names. Not the kind built from ambition, arrangement, or hunger for comfort. This was different. It grew in the humble corners of a poor cabin, in the way Grace saved the better piece of bread for her child, in the way she hid her own fear until no one needed her to be strong anymore. A few hours later, Emily was sitting up with a blanket around her shoulders, sipping warm water from a tin cup. William, trying to be useful despite his injured leg, had taken a small piece of wood and begun carving it with Grace's old kitchen knife. "What are you making?" Emily asked, her voice still weak. "A horse," William said. Emily studied the crooked little shape in his hands. "That does not look like a horse." Grace let out a tired laugh from the stove. William looked at the carving, then back at the child. "It is a very young horse, still becoming itself." Emily smiled and the room changed. That small smile seemed to light every cracked wall, every patched blanket, every tired corner of the house. William had owned chandeliers, silver lamps, and rooms bright enough for grand parties, but none of them had ever warmed him like that child's smile. Grace turned away quickly, pretending to stir the pot, but he saw her wipe the corner of her eye. Later, when Emily had fallen asleep again, Grace sat near the table, her hands wrapped around a cup she had not touched. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For keeping her mind off being scared." William looked at the sleeping child. "She makes it easy." Grace's face softened. "She has had to grow up too fast." "So has her mother," he said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Grace looked at him, then not as a patient, not as a stranger, but as a man sitting close enough to see the places where life had wounded her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. William knew he was standing at the edge of something dangerous. Every kind word from her made his secret heavier. Every smile from Emily made the lie feel crueler. Yet he could not stop wanting to stay in that little cabin near that brave woman and her child, where love was not bought, arranged, or performed. It was lived. And William Ashford, who had once owned almost everything, began to understand that Grace Miller and Emily had given him the one thing his fortune never could: a reason to come home. The next morning, Grace Miller returned to the market. Emily was well enough to sit up in bed with her blanket around her shoulders, and William's leg had healed enough for him to lean on a walking stick and follow at a careful pace. Grace had argued against it at first, but he had looked so determined that she finally handed him the basket of bread and said, "Then make yourself useful." The road into town was bright after the storm, washed clean by rain and shining under the spring sun. Wagons rolled past. Women carried bundles of laundry. Men stood outside the feed store talking about crops, prices, and weather, as if those three things ruled every life in the valley. For Grace, they almost did. She had baked 12 small loaves before sunrise. 12 chances to earn enough for flour, salt, soap, and maybe a bit of coffee if the day was kind. William watched her place them carefully on a cloth at the edge of the market, each loaf golden warm and made from ingredients she could barely spare. People came and went. Some bought. Some touched the bread, asked the price, and walked away as if a poor widow's work should cost less simply because she needed the money more. Grace never changed her expression. She thanked every customer, even the ones who left nothing behind but fingerprints and insult. By noon only 2 loaves remained. William felt relief before he remembered he had no right to feel it. This was not his victory. It was hers. Every coin in the little pouch at her waist had been earned by hands that rose before dawn and kept working after dark. Then an old man stopped in front of the table. His clothes were thinner than William's disguise. His hat was crushed in one hand. His eyes lingered on the bread with a hunger so quiet it was almost more painful than begging. "How much?" he asked. Grace told him. The man lowered his eyes. "I only have half." William expected her to shake her head. Not cruelly. Simply because she could not afford mercy today. Emily still needed food. Rent was still waiting. Flour would not buy itself. Hunger did not excuse hunger in return. But Grace picked up one of the loaves, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and placed it in the man's hands. "Then half is enough." The old man stared at her. "Ma'am, I can't take charity." "It isn't charity," Grace said gently. "It's bread. Eat it while it's warm." He paid what he had and walked away slowly, holding the loaf close to his chest like something sacred. William stood silent. Grace began folding the empty cloth as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "You needed that money," he said. She did not look up. So did he. "But you have Emily. That is why I know what hunger looks like." The words settled between them with the weight of a sermon. William had given from abundance his whole life. He had donated food, paid wages, repaired roads, funded church collections. People had praised his generosity because the gifts were large, but Grace had just given from the edge of need. She had offered bread that cost her something. And somehow that small loaf humbled him more than every grand donation he had ever made. As they walked home in the late afternoon light, William looked at Grace carrying her nearly empty basket, her shoulders straight, her face calm. She had less than anyone he knew. Yet she lived as if kindness were not a luxury. She lived as if it were the last thing a person must never lose. They were halfway home when Grace's steps slowed. William noticed it before she said a word. Her hand tightened around the empty bread basket. Her shoulders, which had stayed straight all morning through bargaining hunger and tired feet, drew in just slightly. A black carriage stood near the bend in the road, blocking the path to her cabin. It was too polished for that muddy lane. The wheels were clean, the horses well fed, and the man standing beside it looked as if he had never carried anything heavier than a pocket watch. He wore a dark coat despite the warmth, with silver buttons that caught the afternoon light. His hat was tilted low, but his smile was wide enough to show he wanted to be recognized. Grace stopped completely. William leaned on his walking stick and studied the man. "Do you know him?" he asked. Grace did not answer right away. "That's Charles Mercer," she said at last. "He owns half the trouble in this valley." The man turned at the sound of their footsteps and his smile sharpened. "Mrs. Miller," he called. "I was beginning to think you had learned to avoid me." Grace moved forward, but William felt the change in her. She was not frightened the way Emily had been with fever. This was different. This was the guarded stillness of a woman who had faced a wolf before and knew better than to run. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" she asked. He glanced past her at the little cabin in the distance, then at the narrow strip of land surrounding it. To most people it was nothing special. A tired patch of earth, a few herbs, a small garden, a leaning fence. But William saw what Mercer saw. The road curved around Grace's property before running toward the south fields. Anyone who controlled that land could control access, water, and passage between several farms. Grace's poverty sat on land worth more than she knew. Mercer took a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I came with a generous offer," he said. "More generous than this place deserves." Grace did not reach for it. "My home is not for sale. Everything is for sale when the price is right. Not this." His smile thinned. "You are a widow with a child, Mrs. Miller. Pride is a poor roof when the rain starts coming through." William felt heat rise in his chest, but he stayed silent. His disguise held him like a chain. A poor ranch hand could not command this man to leave. "Not yet." Grace lifted her chin. "My roof may leak, but it is mine." Mercer laughed softly as if her dignity amused him. For now, Emily, who had been waiting by the cabin door, ran toward her mother and stopped when she saw the stranger. Grace placed a hand on the child's shoulder at once, drawing her close. Mercer's eyes flicked to the girl. "You should think about her. A sensible mother would take the money and move somewhere easier." "There is no easy place for people like us," Grace said. "Only places where men like you haven't reached yet." For one brief moment, Mercer's face hardened. The charm vanished and the threat underneath stood in plain daylight. "You think that little paper in the county office protects you," he said. "Records get lost. Boundaries get corrected. Debts appear. A woman alone should be careful before she refuses a friend." William's grip tightened around the walking stick. Now he understood. Mercer had not come to buy. He had come to warn. Grace's land stood in the way of something bigger, and if she would not give it willingly, he would try to take it another way. Grace stepped in front of Emily. "You are not my friend," she said. Mercer folded the paper slowly and slipped it back into his coat. Then he looked at William for the first time, taking in the worn shirt, the bandaged leg, the muddy boots. "And who is this?" he asked. "Another stray you dragged home." Grace's voice turned cold. "A man who needed help." Mercer smiled again. "You collect burdens like other women collect flowers." William looked straight at him. He wanted more than anything to speak with the full weight of his true name. But he could not. Not without shattering everything Grace believed about him. So he swallowed his anger and watched Mercer climb into his carriage. "This is not over, Mrs. Miller," Mercer said. The carriage rolled away, leaving dust behind. Grace stood still until it disappeared around the bend. Only then did her hand begin to tremble. Emily whispered, "Mama, can he take our home?" Grace knelt and held her daughter's face between both hands. "Not while I'm standing." William looked at them, mother and child framed by the poor little cabin and the fading light. The answer he had searched for in disguise had already found him. But now a darker truth had appeared. Grace Miller did not just need kindness. She needed protection. By the next afternoon, Charles Mercer had stopped smiling from the road and started moving through offices. Grace did not know it yet. She was at home kneading dough with flour dusted across her sleeves, pretending the visit from the black carriage had not followed her into sleep. Emily sat by the window tracing letters in an old primer, though every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the road. William saw it all. Fear had entered the cabin like a draft under the door. Grace kept working, kept speaking softly, kept telling Emily that everything would be all right. But her hands gave her away. They pressed the dough too hard. They paused too long over simple tasks. Twice, she looked toward the small wooden chest beneath her bed, the one where she kept the deed to the land that had belonged to her family for 3 generations. Near sunset a knock came. Not the gentle knock of a neighbor, not the hurried knock of someone needing help. This was slow, official, and meant to make the people inside feel small. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. 2 men stood outside. One was Mercer's assistant, a narrow-faced man named Elias Crow, dressed in a dark suit too fine for a farm road. The other wore a county badge pinned to his vest. His name was Howard Pike, clerk of land records, a man William had seen many times from the other side of polished desks and courthouse meetings. Pike had always bowed too deeply when speaking to William Ashford. Now in front of Grace Miller's poor cabin, he did not bow at all. "Mrs. Miller," Pike said, unfolding a paper, "we are here regarding a boundary correction." Grace's face went pale. "There is no boundary correction." Elias Crow gave a thin little smile. "The county records suggest otherwise." He handed her the document. Grace took it with both hands, but William could see she did not understand the language. Legal words were laid across the page like traps. Adjusted boundary. Prior claim, unsettled tax obligation, failure to respond. Every phrase was designed to confuse a woman who had spent her life reading recipes, church notices, and bills she could barely pay. William pushed himself up from the chair by the stove. Grace glanced back at him, silently warning him not to interfere. But he could not sit still. "What does it say?" he asked. Pike looked at him with open irritation. "This is county business. And she has a right to understand it," William said. Elias Crow's eyes moved over William's worn shirt and bandaged leg. "Can you even read?" The insult landed in the room like a slap. Grace turned sharply. He asked a fair question. For a moment, something like respect flickered through William's chest. Even frightened, even cornered, Grace would not let another person be humiliated under her roof. Pike cleared his throat. "The land surrounding this cabin appears to have been improperly recorded after your husband's death. A portion may belong to Mr. Mercer's estate holdings." "That is a lie," Grace said. Her voice trembled, but she did not lower it. "My husband's father bought this land, his father before him worked it. I have the deed." "Old deeds can be incomplete," Pike replied, "especially when widows fail to maintain proper filings." William watched him closely. The man would not meet Grace's eyes. That was enough to tell him the truth. Grace crossed the room, knelt by the bed, and pulled the small deed from the chest. The paper was worn at the folds, protected with the care poor families give to the few things the world cannot afford to take from them. She handed it to Pike. He barely looked before shaking his head. "This may not be sufficient." William stepped forward, leaning hard on his walking stick. His legs screamed with pain, but anger held him upright. "Look at the signature," he said. Pike froze. William pointed to the bottom of the paper Crow had brought. "That mark claims her late husband acknowledged a boundary dispute 2 years ago." Grace stared at him. "That's impossible." The room went silent. William's voice dropped. "Your husband died before that, didn't he?" Grace's lips parted, but no sound came out. Emily stood from the window, her face white. Crow snatched the document back too quickly. Pike's jaw tightened. "That is not for you to decide," Pike said. "No," William answered, looking at the false paper in Crow's hand. "But someone decided it before walking through that door." For the first time, Mercer's men looked uneasy. Grace stood very still, the old deed pressed against her chest. The threat was no longer a shadow on the road. It had a seal, a badge, and a forged name at the bottom of a page. Mercer was not trying to frighten her anymore. He was trying to erase her. After Howard Pike and Elias Crow left, the cabin did not feel small anymore. It felt surrounded. Grace stood in the center of the room with the old deed pressed against her chest, as if paper could become armor if she held it tightly enough. Emily had not moved from the window. Her small face was turned toward the road, watching the dust settle where the two men had disappeared. William sat back down slowly, but his mind was no longer in that room. It was racing across the valley. Charles Mercer had crossed a line most men only threatened to approach. He had brought a false document to a widow's door. He had used a county clerk like a hired blade. He had placed a dead man's name at the bottom of a lie and expected Grace to be too poor, too frightened, and too alone to fight back. William had wanted to find out whether he could be loved without his fortune. Now he had found something else. Power meant nothing if it stayed hidden while an innocent woman was being crushed. Grace folded the deed carefully and returned it to the wooden chest. Her hands trembled only once, but William saw it. "I'll go to town tomorrow," she said. "I'll ask someone at the church to read the papers again." "They won't stop," William said. Grace looked at him. "Then neither will I." That answer should have filled him with admiration. It did. But it also filled him with shame, because she was preparing to stand alone against wolves while the man sitting by her fire had the name, the records, and the authority to end it. That night, after Emily fell asleep and Grace finally sat down beside the stove, exhaustion took her like a tide. Her head lowered, her sewing slipped from her lap, and for the first time since William had met her, she looked as fragile as the life she had been forced to hold together. He watched her for a long moment. Then he reached for the walking stick. Every step toward the door sent pain through his injured leg, but he welcomed it. Pain was honest. The lie was not. Outside, the moon hung pale over the fields. The old horse was tied near the fence, half asleep, but it lifted its head when William approached. He rested one hand against the animal's neck. "I need one more ride from you," he whispered. He did not leave a note. No words could explain enough without revealing everything, and no truth could be half spoken anymore. He would return with proof, or he would not deserve to return at all. The ride to Ashford Ranch took nearly 2 hours. By the time William reached the main gate, dawn was beginning to silver the eastern sky. The great house rose above the trees, quiet and waiting, its windows dark, its white columns cold in the early light. For the first time, it did not look like home. It looked like a life he had borrowed and forgotten to question. A lantern appeared near the stable. Samuel Reed, his longtime foreman, stepped out with a rifle in hand. The moment he saw William's face beneath the dirty hat, the rifle lowered. "Mr. Ashford." William swung down from the horse and nearly collapsed. Samuel caught him before he hit the ground. "Good Lord, sir, what happened to you?" Later William said. "Wake the house. Open my office. Bring the land ledgers, the southern boundary maps, and every county filing connected to the Miller property." Samuel stared at him, confused and alarmed. "Now," William said. Within minutes the quiet ranch came alive. Lamps were lit. Keys turned in locked cabinets. Dusty record books were carried to William's desk. Samuel spread maps across the table while William, still in a torn shirt and muddy boots, searched with the focus of a man who had wasted too much time pretending to be powerless. There it was. The original survey. The transfer record from Grace's grandfather. The tax receipts filed year after year. And beside them, something even more damning, a recent correction request submitted under Charles Mercer's name, marked with Howard Pike's initials before any legal review had been completed. William placed both hands on the desk and lowered his head. Mercer had counted on Grace having no voice. He had forgotten that land remembers. By sunrise, William had sealed copies of every document, sent Samuel to summon a real attorney, and ordered a carriage prepared for the county office. Then he looked down at the poor man's shirt he still wore. For the first time he understood the weight of both lives the poor stranger Grace had saved and the powerful man who now had to prove he was worthy of that mercy. William Ashford had stopped hiding. And Charles Mercer was about to learn that Grace Miller was not alone. Grace Miller saw the carriage before she saw the man inside it. It came down the road just after mid-morning, rolling past the low fence with polished wheels and two strong horses that did not belong anywhere near her little cabin. Emily stood beside her mother, one hand wrapped in Grace's skirt, her face tense with the same question Grace did not dare ask aloud. Had Charles Mercer come back? Grace stepped in front of her daughter. Then the carriage stopped. Samuel Reed climbed down first, followed by a serious-looking attorney carrying a leather case. Behind them came William Ashford. Only he was not the man Grace had pulled from the ravine. He wore clean clothes now. His hair was combed. His boots were polished. His posture, even with the injured leg, carried a quiet command that no poor ranch hand could fake. The air around him had changed. Or maybe Grace thought it had always been there and she had simply mistaken it for sorrow. William stepped toward her slowly. "Grace," he said. She took one step back. That single step hurt him more than the fall ever had. Samuel removed his hat. "Mrs. Miller, this is Mr. William Ashford of Ashford Ranch." Emily looked up at her mother. "Mama?" Grace did not answer. Her eyes stayed on William. For days this man had slept under her roof. He had eaten her bread. He had listened to her fears. He had watched her cry over her sick child. She had let him see the poor private places of her life, the thin meals, the unpaid rent, the old deed hidden in the wooden chest, the grief she carried for a husband she could not save. In all that time, he had been the richest man in the valley. William saw every thought cross her face. "I can explain," he said. Grace's voice came out quiet. "Then explain why you lied." The attorney shifted uncomfortably, but William did not look away. "I left my ranch because I wanted to know if anyone could see me without my money." Grace gave a soft, painful laugh. "So, you tested people." "I tested the world," he said. "And then I met you." "That does not make it better." "No," William admitted. "It does not." For a moment the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass. Grace's fear had always been simple. Losing her home. Losing Emily. Losing the last fragile piece of the life her husband left behind. But now a new fear opened beneath her ribs. The fear that kindness had made her foolish. The fear that the man she had begun to trust had been watching her like a lesson. William stepped closer but stopped when her shoulders tightened. "I came back with proof," he said. "Mercer's papers are false. Your deed is valid. Howard Pike signed a correction request before any review. We can stop them." Grace looked at the leather case in the attorney's hand, then back at William. "You could have told me who you were." "I know. You let me think you had nothing." "I wanted to be nothing," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Because I was tired of being loved for everything except myself." Grace's eyes filled but her face stayed firm. "And did you ever think what that lie would cost me?" William had no answer. Because that was the wound between them now. Not wealth. Not poverty. Trust. Grace had trusted a wounded stranger because her heart told her to help him. William had hidden behind that trust because his own heart was afraid. Emily reached for Grace's hand. "Is he still our friend?" The question struck both adults silent. William looked at the child, then at Grace. "I want to be," he said. "But your mother has every right to decide that I am not." Grace looked away toward the cabin, her small home standing in the sunlight, poor and worn and still hers. Then she looked back at William Ashford, the rich man, the wounded stranger, the liar, the man who had come with the power to protect her. "I will accept your help against Mercer," she said. "For Emily? For this land?" William nodded, swallowing the ache in his throat. "But do not mistake that for forgiveness," Grace continued. "Protection is not the same as trust." And with those words, William understood the hardest truth of all. It was easier to fight Charles Mercer than to repair what fear had broken inside the heart of one honest woman. The county office had never felt so quiet. Grace Miller stood beside the long wooden table with Emily close against her side, watching men who had ignored poor families for years suddenly straighten their backs because William Ashford had entered the room. Howard Pike avoided her eyes. Elias Crow kept wiping his palms against his coat. And Charles Mercer, standing near the window with his cane in hand, wore the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting a widow and found a wall. William laid the documents on the table one by one. The original deed. The tax receipts. The boundary map. The forged correction request. Every paper landed with a soft sound, but to Grace each one struck like thunder. The attorney spoke calmly. Mercer's claim was false. Pike's filing was improper. The signature tied to Grace's late husband had been created after his death. There would be an investigation. There would be consequences. Mercer tried to laugh. "This is a misunderstanding." William turned to him. "No. This is theft dressed in official language." For a moment, Grace saw the man everyone else knew, the powerful landowner, the respected name, the person whose voice could make a room stop breathing. But now that power was not being used to impress her. It was being used to protect the truth. And that made her heart ache even more. Because if William had been this man all along, then the wounded stranger in her cabin had been real and not real at the same time. When the papers were signed, and Mercer left under the cold eyes of the attorney, Grace should have felt victory. Her land was safe. Emily's home was safe. The little cabin would still stand at the edge of the fields, poor but hers. Yet, as they stepped outside into the afternoon light, Grace felt no joy. William followed her to the shade of an old sycamore tree near the road. He removed his hat, holding it in both hands like a man standing before a judge. "I have no right to ask you for anything," he said. Grace looked toward the town square. "Then don't." He accepted the blow without flinching. "I won't ask for forgiveness," he said. "But I need to tell you the whole truth. Not pieces of it. Not the part that makes me sound lonely and wounded. All of it." Grace stayed silent. William drew a breath. "I was ashamed of my wealth because I let it become a wall. I told myself I wanted to know whether someone could love me without it. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that without my name there would be nothing left worth loving." Grace's eyes softened, but only slightly. "So you hid behind a poor man's shirt?" "Yes," he said. "And I let you carry a burden that was never fair to place on you." His voice broke then, not loudly but enough for her to hear the man beneath the name. "You gave me shelter when you believed I had nothing. You fed me when you had almost nothing. You let me sit beside your fire and see the life you fight for every day. And I repaid that kindness with silence." Grace looked at him for a long time. "I was not angry because you were rich," she said. "I was angry because I trusted you when I was tired of being strong." William lowered his eyes. "That is what I stole," he whispered. The honesty in that answer reached her before she could stop it. Emily, who had been standing a few steps away, came closer and slipped her small hand into Grace's. "Mama," she said softly. He came back. Grace looked down at her daughter, then back at William. "Yes," she said. "He did." The words did not forgive everything. They did not erase the lie. But they opened a door that had been closed since the moment William stepped out of that carriage in clean clothes. Grace lifted her chin. From now on, no more secrets. William met her eyes. No more secrets. And no more tests. Never again? The road between them was still long. Trust would not return in one afternoon, not after fear had cut so deeply. But for the first time, Grace was looking at the real man, not the poor stranger, not the wealthy rancher, but William Ashford, flawed, ashamed, and finally honest. Only then could love begin to breathe. Months later, the little cabin no longer stood alone at the edge of the fields. Beside it rose a warm brick bakery, where widows came before sunrise not to beg but to work. Across the yard, a sewing room filled with light held rows of women bent over cloth, earning honest wages with steady hands. Grace Miller had once fought to keep one small home. Now, because William Ashford had finally learned how to use his power with humility, that home had become a beginning for many others. When Grace married William, she did not enter his grand house as a woman rescued by wealth. She entered as his equal, the woman who had saved him when he was nameless, broken, and poor. Emily walked between them that day, holding both their hands, smiling as if she already knew that love had rebuilt what fear tried to destroy. And this is the lesson: money can open doors, but it cannot prove the value of a soul. The real measure of a person is what they do when no reward is promised, when no one is watching, and when helping someone may cost them something. Grace had almost nothing, yet she gave mercy. William had almost everything, yet he had to lose his mask before he found his heart. So, tell me in the comments. Have you ever seen a small act of kindness change someone's life forever? Share your story below. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and join us for more powerful stories about love, courage, and the quiet heroes who remind us what humanity truly means.